Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. I've been living with a murderer for the past 14 years. There's a murderer in the room with me. Small, unassuming. You wouldn't know it from the look. But I'm certain that at least 11 lives have been cut short by this killer. For 14 years, I've kept the secret. 14 years. I haven't told a soul. Because I knew that if I did, more would die. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Anderson home sat atop a small hill on a 1-acre lot just outside of town. While by no means a mansion, it was a well-kept, respectable residence with a flower garden that won several local awards. As the name suggests, in the mid-80s, it was inhabited by the Anderson family. Father, Tim, worked in sales, and had inherited the house from his parents. Mother, Denise, worked in real estate, and daughters, Kate and Julia, aged 17 and 15 respectively, attended the public high school. Julia was athletic and tall amongst her peers, playing several sports, including soccer and softball. She had a large group of friends and was considered quite popular in her class. Tim coached some of her teams, and Denise was always to be found in the stands loudly cheering. Kate was precisely the opposite of her sister. She never once set foot on a basketball court or attempted running track. Instead, she dressed in mostly black and snuck cigarettes behind the gymnasium at recess. Still, though she was not as widely well-liked as Julia, she did have a small, close-knit group of friends that bonded over one thing in particular: studying the occult. Tim and Denise were fairly active in their church and, it's said, were none too pleased with their older daughter's interest in unholy topics. They dragged her to service every Sunday and forced her into Bible study. But it seemed to have the opposite effect they intended. Kate only became more fascinated with the other side of the coin. Kate and her friends studied Latin and were frequently known to speak to each other in it. They passed notes in class that only they could translate, and hissed insults at other students that only they understood. After complaints from several parents that their children were worried that the satanic kids were putting spells on them, the school warned Kate and company that they'd be suspended if they continued with their demonic nonsense. But the warning wasn't enough. During a free period, a janitor caught them conducting a ritual in a dark, empty classroom, complete with candles and a pentagram drawn on the blackboard. And they were all suspended for a week. That was the last straw for the Anderson parents. They put Kate on lockdown. She was grounded indefinitely and was to have no contact with her friends, only being allowed to leave her room to use the restroom or for meals with the family. And then, on the second day of the suspension, Tim and Denise awoke to a nightmare. Kate hung herself. She was found dangling in her closet when her mother entered to rouse her for breakfast. A noose made from a rope that no one recognized wrapped around her neck. The Andersons were crushed. Yes, she'd been a problematic child, but they'd still loved her deeply. Tim and Denise had been hoping that the suspension would be good for her, that some time away from her friends would maybe help turn her around. Now she was gone, and they didn't understand why. She left no note or explanation. She hadn't been known to be depressed. And, when questioned, Her friends all said that she'd never talked of harming herself. They were all as shocked as her parents were, and were just as devastated by her loss. Worst impacted, though, was Julia. While it may not have been obvious to an outside observer, Julia had actually been very close with her sister, and looked up to her in many ways. Julia admired that Kate didn't care what anyone else thought of her, and that she was truly comfortable with who she was, something that Julia often struggled with. In the days immediately afterwards, Julia sobbed nearly constantly. Everyone did what they could to console her, yet it was largely to no avail, and they mostly thought it best to just let her grieve, knowing that the passage of time would be the only thing that could start the healing. However, at some point shortly after Kate's death, Julia's behavior changed. She still sobbed. That part remained the same, but it's said that it wasn't sadness they saw on her face anymore. It was fear. Julia became paranoid. Her eyes darted wildly around any room that she was in, and she jumped when anyone spoke to her. Friends tried to ask her what she was so afraid of, but she refused to tell them, stating only that they should leave her alone. Worried, they wondered if she might be in some sort of danger, if maybe there was more to Kate's suicide than the Andersons were saying. And those fears were seemingly confirmed when the unthinkable happened. Julia was found hanging in her bedroom too, where the rest of the town had been initially nothing but supporting of Tim and Denise. Now they were suspicious. Kate's death had been a tragedy, no doubt, but she had also been somewhat of a pariah. It wasn't surprising to many that the girl that dressed in black and hung out with a creepy crowd had been troubled enough to tie her own noose. But Julia had been so full of life, so energetic, such a beacon of positivity to her teammates and peers. No one believed that she would have done that to herself. So, an investigation into the girl's untimely demises was conducted. Forensics were investigated. Tim and Denise were both questioned at length. But there was no evidence that they'd done anything wrong, and neither of them confessed to any wrongdoing. In fact, neither of them spoke much at all after Julia's passing, or ever went back to church, or ever went back to work. With nothing to say otherwise, Kate and Julia's deaths were both officially ruled as suicides, and the Andersons were left to return home to their empty nest, one that had once held so much promise. It was thought that it was only a matter of time before one or both of them might be found dangling from a rope themselves. But instead, a month or so after Julia died, a moving truck showed up at the Anderson home. Neighbors saw boxes quickly being loaded, and then, without a word to anyone in town, they just drove away, leaving many of their larger items behind. The house was already paid off and was never put up on the market, and someone continued to pay the property taxes every year, so the locals wondered if one day Tim and Denise might move back in. But they never did. Their home remained vacant from then on. Often, it was pondered why they didn't sell it, but the assumption was that even though they couldn't bear to ever return, they also couldn't bear to lose the place where their daughters had lived their entire short lives. So, year after year, it loomed over the residents below, slowly being reclaimed by nature, a decaying reminder of two young women, taken far too early. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That's, at least, how the events were relayed as local legend. By the time I was born, The house had already sat empty for 5 years. The once award-winning flower garden was overgrown with weeds. The paint was flecked and peeling, and many of the windows were shattered. I, obviously, never knew any of the Andersons personally, but I knew their story by heart before I was in the 4th grade. Every kid in Willow Grove heard it eventually, either from an older sibling, or a friend who'd heard it from an older sibling, or from a friend of a friend who'd heard it from an older sibling. It passed by oral tradition from one generation to the next. There were verifiable facts contained within. The home did indeed belong to a Tim and Denise Anderson. Both of their names were on the title. And the Anderson girls had definitely attended Willow Grove High School. A trophy bearing Julia's name sat in a case near the gym. And Kate could be found in old yearbooks. Kate and Julia had also, most certainly, died of hanging within days of one another. Newspapers covering the story at the time were archived in the library. As for the details of their behavior, those came from classmates of the girls and church members that knew Tim and Denise. It was the main topic of gossip among the townspeople for many years, as nothing else of note ever really happened in Willow Grove, until 14 years ago, given the fact that 2 unbelievably tragic deaths occurred within its walls. The Anderson home was purported to be deeply haunted. Throughout my childhood, I heard many different versions of ways one could have an encounter there. If you look into the middle window on the 2nd floor during a thunderstorm, you'll see a girl hanging when there's a flash of lightning. If you sneak into the house after midnight, you can hear Julia crying in her room. If you're in Kate's bedroom at 3 a.m., the time when they suspect she hung herself, you'll feel as if something is tightening around your neck and you'll struggle to breathe. In time, it became a rite of passage for every teen in town to spend a few hours after dark in the house at some point during their high school career. They always returned with thrilling tales of having been chased through the halls by angry spirits, or being hauled up into the air by their throats. Most of it was surely pure fabrication. But still, to the students of WGHS, having done your hanging night was considered just as important a qualification for graduation as passing all your final exams. And so it was that on the evening of February 10th, 2010, I entered the Anderson home with my 2 best friends, Freddie and James. James Wheeler and I had been inseparable since kindergarten, a pairing based on nothing more than both thinking that the velociraptor was the coolest dinosaur. Yet it was enough to bond us for life. He was a skinny boy of 18, with dark, brown hair and matching eyes, taller than me but shorter than Freddie. Freddie King had joined our party of 2 during our freshman year at WGHS. He transferred in from another school when his dad moved to town for some consulting work, and quickly inserted himself into our lives. Far more outgoing than either James or I, he had boisterously introduced himself, saying that he'd heard that you 2 like video games, and then said, "We're going to be friends." 18 years old in 2010 as well. He had a build to play football, but never went out for the team. Instead, most nights, the 3 of us all felt a certain call to duty, and spent hours dominating our enemies together online. And, unlike James or I, Freddie was also what one would have considered classically good-looking. His blonde hair and blue eyes attracted the attention of several girls in our class. and his perfect teeth had never needed braces. Because of this, Freddie had to occasionally miss our evening gaming sessions when he was out on dates. And, after one such night, he caught up with us at the next day at school looking exasperated. "Guys, you know how I've been seeing Heather, right?" he asked. I smirked. Of course we knew about him and Heather. Half the school was talking about how the head cheerleader was dating that hot nerd. Yay dude, we're part of everybody. So we made that very exclusive list of people who know. James snarked at him. I laughed, and Freddie looked a little embarrassed when he replied, "Shut up, assholes. Look, I need to talk to you guys about something." His expression was very serious. I couldn't help but give a sarcastic response. "She gave you herpes?" "No. Fuck you, man." He tried to look angry, but I could see the smile on his face as he threw a light jab at my shoulder. All right. What's up with you and Heather?" James diffused the situation. "Okay, so last night, we were hanging out at her place and she wanted to watch a scary movie. I guess she likes horror. So, she asked which was my favorite and I told her that I didn't have one 'cause I don't really believe in ghosts or anything and prefer comedies. Well, she was a little put off by that." James and I both rolled our eyes at how stupid he'd been. Yay, I know. I fucked up. I shoulda just said I loved horror and named like literally any movie I know in that genre. But anyway, she asked if I really didn't believe, or if I was just a big scaredy cat because she can't be dating a pussy. And I told her that I wasn't scared of that stuff. I just had never had any paranormal experiences and didn't think ghosts or monsters were real. I cut him off. "Dude, you gonna get to the point anytime soon? We'll be in college before you finish this story." "Fine. Long story short, she wants me to do the hanging knight to prove I'm not a little bitch." For someone that claimed to not believe in ghosts, I couldn't help but notice the touch of anxiety in his eyes as he said it. "Seriously?" James chortled. "I thought we agreed a long time ago that that was a dumb tradition." "Yay man," I added. "Plus, I mean, yay I know like everyone does it. But 2 girls died there. It's super fucking sad. I always thought the whole thing was kinda, I dunno, disrespectful, I guess." Freddie sighed. "Okay, valid points. And agreed it's stupid. But, have you seen Heather? She told me that if I do it, and bring back some proof, I'll be rewarded." His expression went vacant, no doubt envisioning Heather's prize for his bravery. "Dude, come on. There's gotta be easier ways for you to get laid." I was beginning to understand that Freddie was not asking for our opinion. He'd already made up his mind. And James appeared to have made the same connection as he said next. "You're doing this with or without us, aren't you?" Freddie gave us the same look that he had when he told us that he was going to be our friend years earlier. "No, I'm not going to do it without you because you're both coming. You know that I'd do it for either of you." Neither James or I could argue this point, if either of us had even had the slightest chance with a girl. Freddie would have done anything to make it happen for us. "When are we doing this?" James asked. "Tonight. On the night of the 10th. Freddie told his parents that he was going to James's house to study. James told his that he was going to mine, and I told mine that I was going to Freddie's. All of us said we'd be back to our own homes by 10 p.m. As it was a school night, and then set off for the Andersons around 7. It had rained earlier, and the sky remained overcast. As the sun had set shortly after 6, we knew we'd soon be in total darkness, and used flashlights that Freddie had snuck from his garage to guide our way. There was a well-worn path through the woods to the backyard of the Anderson home. Over 20 years' worth of miscreants looking for a thrill had beaten a trail through the brush, and it continued through the overgrown yard leading directly to the back door. For a time, the police had kept an eye on the place and arrested trespassers. But there were just too many to corral. They would have needed to hire an officer full-time to watch the house at night. And there simply wasn't funding for it. And, with no indication that the Andersons would ever return, nor seeming to care for any of the possessions they'd left behind. Eventually, the entire town made a silent agreement to let the local teens go on their little ghost hunts without impedance. As we approached the home, we listened to see if any others had decided that tonight would be their hanging night as well, but heard no sounds coming through the broken windows. So we continued on. We knew from other stories that the back door was always unlocked, and Freddie, being in the lead, was the one to open it and enter first. James and I followed cautiously behind him to see that it was pitch black within, our flashlights the only source of illumination. The door opened into a mudroom, where coat hangers lay scattered across the floor and a thick layer of dust had settled over an old washer and dryer. Scuff marks on the floor indicated that this area was well trafficked, but they lessened where the tile transitioned to the hardwood of the hallway ahead. And I wondered if this was as far as many people made it into the home, too afraid to continue deeper. Freddie was, however, determined that he'd prove his manhood to Heather by going for the full experience, which meant that we were going to need to spend at least 2 full hours in the house, and that we'd need to enter both Julia and Kate's rooms. So, we navigated further inside, stepping into the hallway that branched off to the kitchen, dining room, and living room, shining my light along the walls as I went. I noticed initials and dates had been etched into them. It seemed many that made it past the mudroom wanted to leave a mark proving that they'd done so. Now, at this point, I'll mention that I was terrified the minute we walked through the door. I would never have admitted it to either of them, but I most definitely believed in ghosts at the time. And I most definitely felt uncomfortable invading somewhere that had played host to such horrific events. The only things that kept me moving forward were the fact that I was with my 2 best friends, who, even if they were scared themselves, were both doing their best impressions of nonchalance, and that hundreds of others had done this same thing. And no one had died in the house since Julia. As I was considering this, and listening intently for the slightest sound other than our careful footsteps, Freddie's voice made me jump. "Think we should carve our names in the wall?" he whispered. "No, I don't want a record that we were in here in case the Andersons ever come back." The reason I gave aloud was different than the reason in my head. I really didn't want to potentially upset Julia and Kate by defiling their house. Yay, good point. Well, might as well take a look around if we're gonna be here for a while. He spoke uneasily, and I was somewhat relieved to hear a hint of wavering in his words. At least I knew I wasn't the only one that was feeling anxious. James and I started in the kitchen, while Freddie made his way through the living and dining rooms. But there really wasn't much to see. All of the kitchen drawers and cabinets had been emptied, and the only items remaining in the living or dining rooms were a few large, grimy pieces of furniture. There were lighter spots on the tattered wallpaper where it was obvious that family photos or artwork had once hung. And the curtains on the windows were moth-bitten. It was deeply unsettling. The abandonment struck a nerve somewhere inside me, and a knot twisted in my stomach. "Think we should head upstairs?" Freddie asked, as we regrouped at the base of the steps. "You first." I nudged him. I heard him take a sharp inhale, as if steeling himself, before he slowly crept his way up to the second floor. James threw me an insecure glance, but then nodded, and we went next. My ears had never been so primed for sound. Pausing for a moment after making the ascent, I realized that outside of James and Freddie's footfalls, I heard nothing. No ambient noise, no cars, no crickets, no bats. I'd never understood before that moment how loud silence could be. I became acutely aware of the rapidity of my heartbeat by the pulses reverberating in my eardrums. "Guys, come check this out." Freddie's light shone from inside the first door on the right of the upper hallway, and James and I went through it to meet him. Based on the local lore, we had undoubtedly entered into Kate's bedroom. The walls were painted black, and on them, several pentagrams had been spray painted or etched in. There were other odd symbols here and there, too, that I didn't recognize, but I got the feeling that Kate hadn't likely done any of it herself. As with the lower floor, the furniture had been left behind, but everything else had been removed. There was nothing on the desk or the bedside tables, nothing inside the dresser drawers. The entire space gave an air of emptiness. I didn't like being inside the room. The silence was even more complete there than it had been in the hallway. Even our movements felt muffled. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, someone just out of view, someone that always managed to duck out of my flashlight beam whenever I moved it. Then, behind me, I heard what sounded like a sliding door opening, and suddenly, "Fuck!" Freddie yelled, and I felt his weight shake the floor. I whipped around and shined my light to see that he was on his back, having tripped over his own feet when he'd stumbled away from the closet he'd just opened. I saw what had made him jump, hanging from the clothes rack inside the closet, was a noose. My stomach dropped at once. Were we about to see the phantom of Kate? I wondered. But then James walked forward boldly and touched it. Nothing happened. "It's a prank," he reasoned. "Just a prank. I bet some asshole hung this up in here to scare the shit out of people." I let out the breath I'd been holding and heard Freddie do the same. He slowly got back to his feet and picked up his flashlight. "Let's get out of here," he said. I could see that he was now thoroughly shaken. "Like leave the house?" I asked, hopefully. "No, just out of this room. I don't like it in here." He walked back out into the hallway, and I heard him traipsing in the opposite direction from the stairs. James and I hung back, still trying to calm down, and I checked my phone. It was nearing 8 p.m. We hadn't even been inside for 30 minutes yet. "It'll be over soon," I told myself. "Nothing's really happened yet, it's just a house." I had just managed to decrease my heart rate slightly when, from the direction Freddie had gone, I heard a loud thud, and something dropped to the ground. Freddie yelped in pain. "Oh, son of a bitch!" James and I both darted from Kate's room and saw light coming from the one next to it. We found Freddy inside, rubbing the ankle that he'd clearly just whacked against a small table he hadn't noticed. He'd dropped his flashlight when he'd done so, and it had rolled under the bed. While Freddy continued to spout expletives, I quickly scanned the room, and realized that it was likely Julius. The walls were painted what had once been a very vibrant pink, and it had a different quality to it than the rest of the house. A quality of youth and life. I couldn't explain it, but it made it all the more eerie. Fuck, that hurt. Grab my light, would ya? Freddy indicated to me as I was the closest, and I leaned my head down under the bed frame to retrieve it. And then I saw something odd. The front of the flashlight was sagging into the floor. The weight of it had dropped one end of a floorboard down ever so slightly, and picked up the other side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slipped a couple fingers under the raised edge of the board to find that it was loose. I pulled it up to reveal a small cavity that looked like it was hiding several items. Guys, I think I might have found something, I told the others. Reaching into the opening, I pulled out a very old pack of cigarettes. Maybe Julia had a rebellious side as well, a box of matches. And lastly, a small, very old, and very weathered book. The cigarettes and the matches made sense, and seemed normal enough for a young teenager to hide beneath a floorboard. But the book, there was something strange about the book. The instant I touched it, I'd felt nauseated, and my natural instinct was to throw it as far away from me as I could. I passed the items back to James and Freddy as I removed them from the hole, feeling better the instant that Freddy took the book from me. The fuck is this? Freddy considered its black leather cover as I handed him back his flashlight to inspect it closer. He flipped it open to the first page, and found, sandwiched inside, a folded sheet of notebook paper. Placing the book down on the bedside table, he unfolded the sheet and read the first line. Holy shit, I heard his breaths coming more quickly. Well, I inquired, what does it say? Freddy recited it aloud to us. Mom and Dad, don't read this journal. You will die. Kate showed it to me the day before they caught her and her friends performing that ritual. She'd bought it at a pawn shop because the owner said it was cursed and she was planning to show it to her friends. But I guess she never got the chance before she was suspended. I found it hidden beneath some clothes in her dresser the day after she died. I'm sorry I never told you. I was looking for answers. I wanted an explanation. Well, I found one. I read this, thinking that maybe she'd used it to write her final note. But I was wrong. She hadn't written in it. But someone else had. Someone else had a very long time ago. And I think he killed her. It's too late for me. I've been hearing things at night. He's getting closer. I've tried to get rid of it several times already. Tried burning it, burying it, throwing it out the bus window. It just keeps coming back. I don't think I can stop him. I'm so sorry that I didn't tell you. But I was afraid that if I did, you'd read it, just to try and prove me wrong. I'm hiding this in the hopes that you never find it. But if you should, please just believe me and never read this journal. I don't want him to take you too. We didn't kill ourselves. He did. I love you. Kate loved you too. Julia. Fuck me. I needed to wipe a tear from my eye as Freddy finished. You think it's real? James asked. He looked skeptical. Freddy picked the book back up from the bedside table and studied it more closely. Nah, no way. People have been coming here for over 20 years. You really think no one's ever found that hiding spot before? No. I bet you those same fuckers that hung the noose over in Kate's room left this here to mess with people. Come on. A cursed journal? He was chuckling slightly as he finished, working his hardest to convince himself. Here, he opened back to the first page and read off. Property of Archibald Wiggins. Archibald Wiggins? James burst out laughing. Yay. I think I'm with you. No way that's a real name. Jesus. They had me going there for a minute with that note. However, I didn't share either of their conviction that it was all just a joke. I dunno guys. That spot was pretty well hidden. And I kinda felt something when I touched that thing, like kinda sick. Freddy cracked up again. Dude. It's a book. You're really scared of it? He thumbed through the pages. Whoever wrote this is just a wannabe horror writer. It's nothing but a bunch of graphic descriptions of murders from the 1870s, and holy crap. Listen to this. On the last page. I, Archibald Wiggins, am the devil's servant. The law is closing in. They found the bodies. What sorrow that my wicked life be cut short before I could take more with me. Unfortunately, I shall be swinging at the end of a noose before the week is out. But my work will carry on. 7 have already met their fate at my hands. And though I will soon be removed me from my earthly body, I will never stop, for upon these words, I place a curse. Whomever shall read them, will share my fate. Veniam ad te. Bullshit. James grabbed the journal from Freddy's hands and read the page himself. His face broke into an incredulous smirk as he finished it. Ooh, real scary. He joked. The hell is Veniam ad te? That Latin? He tried to hand the journal to me. Eric. Check this out. But I refused. I didn't care that they were going to make fun of me. There was something wrong with it. Something malignant. I didn't want to ever touch it again. Keep that thing away from me, I said forcefully. Aight, whatever dude. James tried to laugh off my cowardice. But I caught the slightest hint of apprehension on his face as he handed it back to Freddy. I wondered if he felt some of the darkness that I had when he was holding the journal and was now somewhat regretting his choice to read it. I gotta show this to Heather. I was just gonna have one of you take a picture of me in here as proof. But this is way better. Come on. I won't make you guys stay the full 2 hours now that we've got this. We're not gonna see any ghosts anyways, unless Archibald shows up. Freddy made fake ghost noises, taunting me, while he folded up Julia's note and stuck it back inside the journal. He and James started towards the door, cackling about Archibald coming to get us when suddenly, they both froze. Did you hear that? James was on high alert. Hear what? I replied. The air was still oppressively quiet around me. The whistling, said Freddy. All right, I get it guys. I'm a bitch for not reading the journal. How long are you gonna mess with me? My hair stood on end. I was willing myself to believe they were just screwing around. But I had no idea how they'd coordinated it so quickly and perfectly without me seeing. Shush, James implored. We all stood dead still for a minute before Freddy said, "Must have been a bird up in the attic or something." But he didn't sound totally convinced. James agreed with him. Yay, probably. Let's get out of there though. We quickly made our way back downstairs and out through the mudroom. Once I was back in the cold night air, the knot that had twisted itself tighter in my stomach each minute that we'd remained inside began to loosen. I started to feel a little silly about having been so terrified of a book. That, to James and Freddie's points, had likely just been planted to scare people. But all the same, I had no intention of ever reading it. We parted ways after exiting the woods, and went back to our respective homes, all proud of ourselves for having survived our hanging night, and with Freddie excited to see Heather the following day. But, the next day at school, neither Freddie or James looked as triumphant as the night before. Both had large bags under their eyes, and were slightly twitchy. They were talking to each other in low whispers by Freddie's locker when I approached. "Jesus, you guys look like shit. You stay up all night gaming again?" I tried to remain optimistic, but my heart had sunk the minute I saw them. Something was wrong, and I already knew it had nothing to do with video games. "No, did you hear anything last night? After you got home?" James was shuddering. His expression ran ice through my veins. "Nothing out of the ordinary. I fell asleep pretty much right when I got back though and was out until my alarms went off this morning. You okay?" I wanted to be comforting, but the knot in my stomach had returned. Freddie's eyes darted back and forth from one end of the hallway to the other, like he was expecting something out of place to appear at any moment. James began again. "I just didn't get much sleep. Every time that I was about to doze off, there was this whistling. It's a song, but I don't recognize it. I swear it was exactly what I heard when we were leaving the Andersons." Freddie slowly nodded. It was clear he'd had the same night that James had. "We shouldn't have read that journal," he said in a low, shaking voice, leaning back against his locker to support himself, all the while. His eyes kept shifting up and down the corridor. I waited for one of them to crack a smile, for Freddie to punch my shoulder like he always did when we were joking around, but their faces remained unchanged. "Guys, look, I know I wouldn't read it last night, but I dunno. I'm sure it's not actually cursed. We probably all just got really worked up by that note, and you both said yourselves that it was likely a prank. What you're hearing is probably in your heads." My mouth formed the words, but my brain didn't fully trust them. Nothing in the note or the journal had said anything about whistling. James and Freddie never logged on that night for our usual evening gaming session, and were worse at school the following day. Again, neither of them got any sleep, and again they'd heard the whistling, but they looked more terrified than before. Freddie could barely talk and James couldn't stop fidgeting. "He's getting closer," James explained. "I didn't just hear him last night, I saw him. There was a presence in my room, a darkness behind me. I rolled over to check and at first, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But then, a shadow shifted in the corner. It looked like, oh, Jesus," he trailed off. "Do you know what veniam ad te means?" he asked. "No, the first time I heard it was the other night." I couldn't even feign that what they were experiencing might not be real anymore. They were both so genuinely frightened. I looked it up. It's something like, "I will come to you." James paused. "Eric, I think we fucked up." I don't think Julius' note was fake. I think he's coming for us." Tears were welling in his eyes. Freddie had begun hyperventilating while James was talking. I turned to him and asked, "Do you still have the journal?" He gave a sideways glance at his backpack on the floor. "You have it here with you?" I was shocked that he was carrying the source of his torment around with him. He blurted out in a pained whisper, "Well, I can't leave it at home. What if one of my parents reads it, or my little brother?" "You don't understand. He's not coming for you. I even broke up with Heather because I don't want her with 10 feet of this thing. Thank God I didn't go see her on my way home from the Andersons." He put his face down into his hands. "Okay, well, we'll get rid of it. Or destroy it. Burn it or something." Even as I said it, I remembered Julius' words. "Don't you think I've tried?" You heard what Julia wrote too. Yet I tried anyway, but she was right. Burning it, tearing it up, throwing it in a lake, burying it, it always comes back. Now I understood why Freddie's eyes were constantly searching. James was looking defeated, but I wasn't ready to give up. Maybe we can take it to Father McKay? Maybe he can do a ceremony on it or something. Break the attachment that it has to Archibald. He knows our families. What if he doesn't believe us? What if he tells our parents and they take the journal and read it? James was right. All of our families attended the same church. I don't know how much time we have either. He was so close last night. My mind was reeling, trying to think of something that we could do. Fuck. Okay, tonight, you guys can stay at my house. My parents are going to a play in the city and won't be back until the morning. I'll look up some stuff on how to cleanse cursed objects and we'll deal with this thing ourselves. We'll camp out in the backyard like we used to. There's no trees and it's a couple 100 yards from the woods. Nothing to hang from. I'll stay up all night with you guys and we'll get rid of him somehow." We were foolish boys. Asterisk. That night, I pitched a tent in the backyard and printed off every invocation, chant, ceremony, and ritual I could find that said it would help us destroy the journal. Many of them involved holy water, Bibles, rosaries, various holy objects. Luckily, between the three of us, we were able to gather up all the materials we'd need to conduct the blessings by taking items our religious parents had stored around our houses. James and Freddie arrived around 6 p.m., and as we were making our way to the backyard, James pulled me aside, telling Freddie to continue to the tent and start setting up. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not sure this is going to work." I tried to reassure him. "James, it's going to." But he cut me off. "Just listen to me for a minute. We can feel him, and he's near. I can't explain it, but we know that he'll reach us tonight. If this doesn't work, and he comes for us, you can never tell our families the truth. Do you understand?" Freddie and I have agreed and have written notes explaining that we've been depressed for a long time and plan to do it together. That you had no idea. He stopped for a moment. I could tell this speech was rehearsed, that he was doing his best to hold it together. But he was convulsing, collecting himself. He continued, "We can't risk anyone ever reading that thing again. If we die, you'll have to hold onto it. Keep it away from everyone. Forever. Please, Eric, swear that you'll do this." James the First, "Swear." Okay, I swear. Thank you." He looked the slightest bit relieved, and we made our way outside to join Freddy. Inside the tent, by candlelight, we began shortly after dark, throwing everything we had at it, dousing it in holy water, holding rosaries, chanting Bible verses. James and Freddy were desperate in their fevered attempts to kill the thing that had been stalking them for days. And for a time, we thought it might be working. Neither of them heard the whistling, and the presence they'd felt seemed to be moving farther away. I even saw Freddy crack a smile for the first time in 2 days. But then, sometime after midnight, they both froze again, just like they had on our hanging night. No, Freddy whimpered. Both of their heads swung around and fixated on the back wall of the tent. Then, they followed something moving around us towards the entrance. Oh God, no. My heart was in my throat. I wanted to reach out and hold onto them. But I was suddenly overcome with exhaustion. Blackness pressed in on my vision and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I heard was the zipper opening, and the screams of my best friends before I passed out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The tent was empty when I awoke in the dawn sunlight on the 13th. But I didn't need to go far to find my missing friends. When I poked my head outside, I saw James and Freddy swinging in the early morning breeze. 2 trees, side by side, right at the edge of the woods that we thought were too far away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I kept my promise to James and never told his or Freddy's family the truth. The notes they'd written were convincing, and both of their deaths were designated as suicides. And 2. I've held on to the journal ever since. It sits locked in a safe in my bedroom. While I've never read it, Archibald's curse has been burned in my memory ever since that night at the Anderson house. Over the years, I've considered different ways of getting rid of it, but all of them come with an inherent risk of someone reading it if I was unsuccessful. And I don't want to give Archibald the satisfaction of taking another life. For a while, I tried to research him, to see if maybe I could find his remains and destroy those, wondering if maybe that would break his curse. But I can't find anything about a murderous Archibald Wiggins from the 1870s. They didn't keep the best records back then. So, the simplest solution, I thought, was that the journal would just stay with me. I wrapped it in plastic a long time ago because I have a theory that it stays with whoever touched the cover last. It's why it's never left me. And why it never left the Anderson home until Freddy took it. And my will stipulates that I be buried with it. I'd hoped that that would be enough to put an end to it all. But I think he's getting annoyed with having been hidden away for so long, contained by a life that he can't take. I might need to try something different soon. Because recently, at night, I swear I've heard a muted whistling. Story: Murder Mansion, a true Kentucky horror. Nestled in the center of Warren County, KY, lies the small town of Bowling Green. Its small size and unassuming nature belie the fact that it's actually the 3rd largest city in the state. In the last several decades, the town has seen a massive economic boom and its stature within the state has grown as well. The town is home to the famed Corvette Museum and Factory, Western Kentucky University, now the 2nd largest college in the state, the headquarters of Fruit of the Loom, and the Lost River Cave, one of the most beautiful and unique natural wonders of the United States. With its scenic beauty and thriving economy, Bowling Green has become a beacon of prosperity for the entire state. However, not all that long ago, things were much different in Bowling Green. Back in 1948, the town was just starting to stretch its feet, with a brand new union underwear factory opening up during this time, which provided a greatly needed boost to the town's economy. Dr. Charles Martin and his wife Martha lived in relative luxury due to a lifestyle afforded to them by Dr. Martin's status as a prominent physician in town. They lived on the outskirts of downtown Bowling Green in an elegant yet imposing mansion across the street from Fairview Cemetery, where they raised their son Stonewall Martin. The mansion, where the Martins would live for 30 years, was bought by the family in 1918 and was considered a local landmark by the population during this time. The Martins were well known in the community for the extravagant parties they often held in their home, and on more than one occasion possibly tried to set up their son with someone he could marry. As the years went on and Stonewall grew older, their efforts grew fruitless and Stonewall would find himself a bachelor at age 52. Harry Edward Kilgore was born on February 28, 1923. He lived in Glasgow, KY, and much like the Martins, the Kilgores were also well known in their hometown as Harry's grandfather owned the town newspaper. Despite this, Harry's early childhood must have been filled with hardship, as his father Reed Kilgore committed suicide in 1925, leaving his mother Ella to take care of Harry and his sister Ella alone, though she did eventually remarry. In his youth, Harry developed an interest in music, and sought schooling in Glasgow before moving to nearby Bowling Green to attend Western Kentucky University. There, he met Ruth Ann McKinney, a fellow WKU student who was a few years younger than him. Despite this year gap, a connection formed between the two of them, and they quickly became an item. The two students eventually crossed paths. George Daggett, who was 35 at the time and a music professor at WKU, as well as the head of the piano department. George and Harry were said to have become very good friends, and would spend days and weeks together at a time. George himself said he only gave extra attention because of Harry's interest in music, though this would come into question much later on. Around this time, Ruth Ann McKinney came into the company of Stonewall Martin, most likely at a party or some other social function, and the two apparently hit it off, as the two were soon married on June 23, 1948, leaving shortly after that on their honeymoon. Neither of their lives would ever be the same when they returned. Just a few days after Ruth and Stonewall Martin left Bowling Green, on June 29, under the cover of darkness, Harry Kilgore drove his car to a wheat field close by Fairview Cemetery. He then grabbed a revolver and walked the remaining distance to the home of Charles and Martha Martin. He broke in through the door and entered the home, where he caught Dr. Martin by surprise in the front hallway. Without hesitation, Harry fired several shots at Dr. Martin, one of which hit him in the head. The wounded Dr. Martin tried to flee back into his bedroom, but the 80-year-old retired physician was no match for Harry, and as he fled into his bedroom, Kilgore fired several more rounds into the doctor. Harry then shot Martha Martin in the back of the head as well when she attempted to flee. Evidence collected by police and later Harry's own testimony showed that Harry spent a great deal inside the Martin home after committing the murders. He allegedly tormented the Martins further, even in death. by abusing their corpses with a flashlight and shooting them both several more times. After stealing some personal items from the family, Harry left the Martin home and later told police he disposed of the gun by throwing into the Barron River as he fled Bowling Green and drove back to Glasgow. Once there, he sought refuge with his mother Ella, where he would be found later by police. The next morning at around 7 a.m., the bodies of Dr. Martin and his wife were found by two workers who were scheduled to be on the property that morning. Police were quickly called to the scene, and they soon have a lead on the case. Working from a tip, police traveled to Glasgow to talk to Harry. They found him in his car, parked right in front of his mother's house. Police asked Harry to come back to Bowling Green, which Harry did willingly. A search of Harry's car came up with several of the Martins' belongings, including Martha's purse, and a flashlight with broken glass along with .32 caliber shell casings. These were later used to tie Harry to the murders during the trial. In Harry's original confession, he took full credit for the murders and didn't name or list anyone else as an accomplice. He stated that he was angry with the Martins because their son Stonewall had lured his girlfriend Ruth Ann away from him, and he killed Stonewall's parents as an act of revenge. From the very onset of the case, Harry's sanity was continually called into question, and Harry changed his statement several times since his original confession. After being judged as sane enough to stand trial, Kilgore pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison for both accounts. Though 14 months later, after receiving his sentence and being returned to jail, Kilgore made a surprise confession, one that sent ripples through the case, and to this day is a source of controversy and mystery. Despite originally claiming to have committed the murder alone, he now claimed to have had an accomplice, his music professor George Daggett. According to Harry's confession, George Daggett and Harry concocted a plan for both of them and Harry's girlfriend Ruth Ann to lure in Stonewall Martin and use him to steal his parents' vast estate. Ruth Ann was to marry Stonewall. Then George and Harry were to murder both of Stonewall's parents so their assets would be inherited by Stonewall. Then they were to murder Stonewall and have Ruth Ann inherit the entire estate. The three of them were then to share the money and live together in luxury for the rest of their lives. Harry's testimony was heavily scrutinized due to his mental state. Researchers observed his depravity and desire to kill, and this caused others to question if Harry was telling the truth. Nonetheless, based off Harry's testimony, an indictment of accessory and extortion was handed down on George Daggett. For his part, George fiercely denied the allegations and provided a timeline of events that occurred on the night of June 29. George stated Harry came to his apartment, very distraught, and asked the professor to come to the university with him. The two made their way to the music building, but left after seeing that the building was occupied. The two walked about town for a time before George returned to his apartment and bid Harry goodbye sometime around midnight. George would even testify to Harry's mental instability throughout his time as a student at WKU, including his delusions and threats to kill members of his own family. But several key factors and pieces of evidence would cast doubt on Daggett's innocence. Most damningly, Harry testified that the revolver used in the murders was stolen from a former roommate of George Daggett's. The gun was stolen about 6 months before the murder and 4 months after George had moved out of the property. Friends and students reported George and Harry had spent a lot of time together in the months leading up to the murders. Though George continued to assert he was just helping shepherd Harry's growing interest in music. George Daggett would resign from his position at WKU as his trial commenced. George would later be convicted by a jury of his peers and sentenced to 11 years in prison. However, his conviction would later be overturned due to a lack of evidence. And another trial would end in the exact same way, with the charges against George eventually being dismissed. The prosecuting attorney in the trial believed that George was the mastermind behind the murders, and was the contributing factor in Harry's downfall, but not enough evidence could be found to prove this. George fled Kentucky after the trial and moved to Detroit. He apparently found work as a piano player, and would spend the rest of his life there until dying of a heart attack in 1963. Although the circumstances surrounding his death are shrouded in mystery to this day. For her part, Ruth Ann was never investigated and a connection to the murders was never formally established. Although some involved in the case suspected Ruth Ann and even Ella Kilgore were involved in the murders and the conspiracy, nothing ever came of these rumors, and both women lived the rest of their lives in peace. Tragedy would continue to follow the remainder of the Martin family though, as Stonewall would die 9 years later in 1957. Whether or not it was a conspiracy or a random tragic coincidence, Ruth Ann McKinney eventually ended up with the Martin family fortune, which according to sources close to the case, Ruth Ann was in a real hurry to collect. She allegedly visited the Martins' bank daily for weeks, hounding tellers and bankers for her late husband's money. Harry was coincidentally up for parole that same year, and was denied by the parole board. Harry's sanity was questioned several more times in the intervening years, although he was judged as mentally sane and judged to have known the difference between right and wrong each time. He served about 16 years of his life sentence before finally earning an early release on parole. And when he left the jail after all those years, Ruth Ann was waiting for him. As a part of his parole agreement, Harry and Ruth Ann left Bowling Green and moved to Fort Pierce, Florida, where the two lived together until Harry's death in 1981. When Harry left his house to go on a bike ride and was struck down by a passing motorist, Harry died in the street and was laid to rest in Florida, leaving behind a mystery with more questions than answers. The murders were a big news story in Bowling Green, with many reporters and journalists from surrounding towns traveling to Bowling Green to cover the story and trial. Questions surrounding the case still remain today, and documents covering the murders as well as documents from both trials can be found in the Kentucky History Museum located on WKU's campus. As for the town, Bowling Green moved on from the murders and has become a symbol of Kai's renewed economic growth. The mansion the Martins were tragically killed in still stands today, and has exchanged hands several times since the murders. The house has become infamous in Bowling Green's history and is referred to as Murder Mansion by locals in reference to its bloody past. A mythology of sorts has developed around the house in the decades since then. It was reported that when the house was sold in the 60s after remaining vacant since the murders, blood stains could still be seen on the hardwood floors. And as is typical for such crimes, rumors of paranormal activity in the house have persisted since, though previous owners have denied any such activity having ever occurred in the house. and these reports remain unsubstantiated. Previous owners have also taken the house's reputation in stride, carrying on the Martins' tradition of holding annual parties at the mansion, with some of these parties falling on Halloween. The newest owners of the house has distanced themselves from the mansion's infamous past and discouraged sightseers from taking pictures of the house and visiting the property. It seems despite moving on and establishing a new identity for itself, Bowling Green and the murder mansion will never quite escape the shadow of its violent history. This story ends on an unexpected and somewhat poignant note. While investigating this story, someone close to the case and to Fairview Cemetery reported to me that Ruth Ann McKinney had been back to Bowling Green as recently as 2012 to see if her grave marker next to her first husband Stonewall Martin was still there and open. Despite the tragic events that have marked her life since marrying him, it seems Ruth Ann still held affection for her husband. It should be noted that though Ruth Ann and Harry Kilgore lived together after his release from prison, they were never married. Ruth Ann was the last survivor of the Martin murder saga, and she passed away in November 2017. Whatever role she may or may not have played in this mystery, let us hope that Ruth Ann McKinney and the rest of the Martin family have finally found their peace. Story: The Odd Kids. One summer, when I was a boy, my parents sent me to stay with my grandparents for the break. Raised in the Pacific Northwest, a small town in eastern Mississippi might as well have been an entirely different country for all I was concerned. The instant we got out of the airport, I was struck with the oppressive humidity. And I became convinced right then and there that my parents downright despised me. Of course, the reality was much kinder than that. My grandparents were good folks, and thankfully I met a girl within a few days of arrival, and we became fast friends. Her name was Jessie, a local girl with long blonde hair and green eyes, the first pair I'd ever encountered. I was in love at first sight. Jessie was a year or two older than me, but that didn't matter much to us. Jessie was the reason I got up every morning, not in a romantic sense, of course, but a very literal one. Sure, my grandparents were very hospitable, but they were old and southern, about as far removed from my narrow worldview as could be. They just had no idea how to entertain me, and I think Jessie was as much a relief to them as she was to me, taking me off their hands during the days and curtailing somewhat my boundless youthful energy. The place where my grandparents lived was about a mile out from a place called Ashbury Wood, and it was a mile I walked daily. I would always meet Jessie on the path, heading my way. On rare occasions she would already be at my grandparents' house when I was leaving, and I never saw where she lived. It didn't matter much to me, though, because the woods were our real home. Ashbury Wood wasn't particularly dense, but boy did it seem to go on forever. Jessie showed me a few paths around the woods, unofficial trails to interesting sites like clearings, hollowed-out trees, or even just a place where a funny-looking bush was growing. We told each other stories of our hometowns, imagining what life would be like if one of us lived where the other did. Whenever we fantasized about having her come live with me, she would get a strange tone in her voice. But I never thought much of it. While the woods were our home and playground, we still set limits for ourselves. If we went too long without seeing something Jessie recognized, we immediately turned around until we were in familiar territory again. She also set boundaries, significant features we shouldn't go past for one reason or another. Decades later, and the only one I can remember is the creek. The creek itself was nothing to be concerned about. It was just a shallow stream of water that may have come up to my waist, with sloped banks on either side that were sheer but not insurmountable. The first time I discovered it, I immediately headed down into the water, just about ready to cross to the other side when Jessie cried out from behind me, "Stop!" I whirled around on one foot as gracefully as a young boy can and looked up at her. She stood staring across the creek and out into the woods on the other side. Her hands were balled into fists and kept straight at her sides. And I remember being worried that she might begin crying. I climbed back up the side of the creek, coming up beside her. "What's wrong?" I asked. "We need to turn around." Jessie's voice was barely above a whisper. She looked terrified, and slowly peeled her gaze away from the trees and onto me. "We have to turn back." Reluctantly, I agreed, but only because I could see how upset the situation was making her. Like I said, the water itself wasn't that deep or rapid, and it wasn't even that far into the woods. On the walk back I raised these points, but Jessie stayed quiet, leading me to a small clearing in the trees that we used as a sort of home base for our adventures. Sitting me down, Jessie stared into the grass for a long moment before she spoke. 2 years ago I had a friend named Emma. Her hands were balled up in her lap, shaking. We used to play in these woods, like you and me do. And one day, just like you and me, we found that creek. I laughed, not because of the content of the story, but because I'd never heard someone pronounce it, crick, before. Her head snapped up to look me in the eyes and I fell quiet. Standing across from it was these kids who looked about our age. Only, they weren't right. That time there was only 2. One of them, his head just hung to the side like this. Jessie let her head flop to the left, hanging limp. Another was real tiny, and his hands and head were even littler, like tinier than a baby's. Now, I'm not proud of this next part, but we weren't exactly sugar and spice to him, if you know what I mean. I shook my head that I did not. She sighed. We would call him names, tease him, you know, because they was weird. Emma would throw sticks sometimes, though she couldn't hit water if she fell out of a boat. The story paused as Jessie smiled to herself, remembering her friend fondly. Did they ever talk back? I asked, bringing her back to reality. Nah, she said, shaking her head. Just stood there looking at us and making these weird squeaking noises. Emma and me, we started calling them odd kids. 'Cause, you know, they were kids and they sure as shit were odd. I blushed at such intense language, but Jessie didn't notice. But no matter what we did to him, they never came across the creek. Always just stood on the other side, staring and squeaking. Wasn't always the 2, neither. There was different ones, 4 or 5 in all, I think. What happened to Emma? The direction the story was going was obvious, and I was eager to learn. Jessie stayed quiet for a long while, staring into the ground and absently picking at the grass beneath her. So at first we were afraid, right? The odd kids weren't normal, and we would scare each other silly telling stories of how they eat people and like to run around naked together. Just dumb stuff. But as time went on, we got less and less scared of him. It got to the point where we'd stand right on the other side of the creek and dare them to cross over. But they never would. One day, we're sitting there talking to ourselves, ignoring the weird-headed one like he's just another tree. And Emma said something about him being too chicken to cross. We both looked at him, and he just walked off, turned around and went deeper into the woods, till eventually we couldn't see him. And I teased Emma that he was daring her to follow him, that she was a chicken if she didn't go. I was listening with rapt attention at this point. To my young mind, this girl's tale of terror more closely resembled a great campfire story, made even better by the fact that it allegedly took place only a brisk walk away from where I sat. Together, the two of us crossed the creek, 'cause like you said it ain't that big, and we climbed up onto the other side and chased after him. We went maybe a quarter mile in before we start hearing that squeaking again. Only up close it didn't sound like squeaking anymore. It sounded like chittering. They surrounded us faster than either of us expected, coming out of the trees like ghosts. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move a muscle, just staring at the odd kids and wondering what was gonna happen. Then one of them, the limp-headed one, he grabbed Emma and she screamed, and it's like it woke me up. I tore out of there as fast as I could go, practically leapt the creek in a single jump, and ran all the way home. My lungs was on fire by the time I stopped, and I was crying all over the place. People trying to get me to tell them what happened. But her voice trailed off and I could see tears welling in her eyes. "Did you?" I asked. She shook her head, blinking away the tears. "I felt guilty," she admitted. "I felt guilty for leaving her. And I just kept thinking that she'd come home, that she'd be right behind me and we'd cry about it and never ever go across that damn creek again. But she didn't." Jessie shook her head again. "But she didn't," she repeated. "She didn't ever come back. Nobody ever went looking for her neither, 'cause she was an orphan." I didn't say nothing, and so nobody even knew to look. Staring out into the woods in the direction of the creek, Jessie's voice cracked. "The odd kids got her. I don't know what they did with her. I'm sorry." I tried consoling her, unsure of what to say. But Jessie wasn't paying attention to me anymore. She stood up, brushed the dirt off her denim shorts, and started walking towards town. I got up and chased after her. "Wait," I cried. "Where are you going?" "Home." "Home? But why?" The concept seemed alien to me. It was the middle of the day. Who would want to stay indoors? "I can't stay in these woods. Not today." She paused. "You should go home too. We'll meet up tomorrow morning." But nothing. She stopped and turned to face me. "Go home." Jessie started to turn around again before something else occurred to her. "And don't ever go across the creek. You hear me?" I nodded silently, and she reached out, grabbing my shoulders and giving me a firm shake. "Say it," she demanded. I promise. No going across the creek," I said timidly. She stared into my eyes, as if searching my soul for a way to ensure my sincerity. Whether she found it or not, she eventually released me and headed off, leaving me standing alone in the woods with nothing on my hands but free time and my own thoughts. I looked back in the direction of the creek and the mysterious woods beyond. Were there really such a thing as odd kids? I knew monsters didn't exist in Oregon, but here in Mississippi it felt like anything could be true. Plus, Jesse had told the story with such conviction that it felt disloyal to be skeptical. I spent the rest of the day in the woods, wandering aimlessly. Part of me wanted to go back to the creek, but real or not, Jesse's story had scared the hell out of me. At one point I got just close enough that I could make the creek out through the trees. And I peered as hard as I could at the bank on the other side. I wanted to make out a pair of eyes staring back at me. Or hear that chittering Jesse had talked about. Heck, at that point I would have accepted a quick blur between the trees as concrete evidence, but despite my willingness to believe, nothing came forward to present itself. The opposite bank was devoid of life, and I didn't have the gall to investigate any closer. As the sky dimmed, I reluctantly began the long walk home. Unaccompanied for the first time all summer, I considered Jessie's story of the odd kids, and almost started to get a little angry with her. Of course they didn't exist. She made them up just to mess with me, and threw in another girl, conveniently orphaned, to drive home the scare. I shook my head and laughed, thinking about how gullible I had been. Later at dinner, I ate with the ferocity of an animal. I hadn't realized how hungry I'd become, alone in the woods all day thinking. And the chicken my grandmother cooked was the most delicious thing I'd ever eaten. It was only on my third drumstick that I stopped long enough to ask them a question. Did you guys ever hear of anyone going missing in the woods? I asked between bites, interrupting the regular mealtime silence. They looked at one another quizzically, as if searching their collective memory. No, I don't think so, my grandmother eventually said. Don't ring any bells. Her husband agreed. Why do you ask? I shook my head, taking another bite to buy myself some time to think of an answer. Just something I heard some kids talking about. I told them. Some jerks were trying to scare Jesse and me by saying a girl named Emma went missing. Suddenly, my grandmother's eyes lit up with recognition. You know, I didn't hear nothing about that. But I do recall that girl being terrified of those woods. She nodded thoughtfully over a spoonful of corn. Yeah, it was a couple years back that the girl come tearin' out of the woods like the devil himself is on her heels. Screamin' and cryin'. I didn't nose my way into it on account of her father askin' people if they would leave his daughter alone. But I overheard that the girl weren't right for a couple weeks. Just sittin' in her room and not talkin' to nobody. She clucked her tongue and took another bite of corn. Lord only knows what happened to that girl, but it shook her somethin' fierce. I suddenly felt a sick terror in my stomach, like the feeling you get watching a recording of yourself only to see something terrifying looming just out of your sight. Something you never knew was there. Did this mean the odd kids were real? Had they been watching me as I stepped into the creek? So you never found out what happened? I hesitantly asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. Grandma just shook her head, and the three of us continued eating in silence. Grandpa brought up a baseball game he'd seen on TV earlier that day, and I feigned interest as well as I could. But I wasn't all there. My mind was back in the woods at that creek, inspecting every square inch of my memory for a sign of something else. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it did, it was wrought with nightmares. Thoughts of the odd kids crawled through my mind, bringing me back to the creek. Looking deeper into the woods, I saw dozens of pairs of eyes staring back at me, slowly bobbing back and forth as though they were advancing towards me. My dream self was paralyzed. helpless to do anything but watch as the monsters came out of the shadows. The one Jesse had described, with his head sagging to the side, lead the plotting advance. As a group, the odd kids crawled down into the creek, dragging broken limbs and torn flesh behind them, each of them chittering off tempo with the others to create a horrible cacophony of noise that filled my ears and bore into my soul. Staring into the hungry eyes of the limp-headed leader as he reached out to drag me down, I awoke screaming. The noise still rang in my ears and, coupled with my panic, caused me to flail against my blankets as though they were trying to engulf me. I fell onto the floor with a hard thud. Finally coming to rest, my grandfather burst into the room and my grandmother was close behind him. "Are you okay?" he bellowed, still full of adrenaline even though he was beginning to realize there was no threat. Embarrassed, I kicked the sheets off of me and stood up. "Yeah, just a bad dream," I muttered, as I came to my senses. I realized the noise I had been hearing was the sound of cicadas filling the room, broadcasting their mating calls to the world, laughing off their overzealous response. My grandparents led me downstairs to breakfast, which I accepted readily. That morning, I walked all the way to the woods without running into Jessie. I stood at the edge of the path looking back down the road, trying to make out her figure, but nobody was there. Sighing, I walked all the way back to my house, then down to the woods again. There was no sign of her. My adolescent mind filled once more with nightmarish imagery, but I did my best to stay grounded in reality. She was the last person who would have gone across the creek. And if the odd kids ever ventured out of the woods, surely people around town would talk about them, right? Armed with these rationalizations, I decided to head to our favorite clearing and wait for her. She wasn't there when I arrived. Part of me had expected her to be waiting in the grass, ready to laugh in my face when she learned how I'd walked up and down the path 2 more times before thinking to check our spot, and as an hour slowly ticked by, I began to wonder if something bad really had happened to her. But, if something had, what was I going to do about it? I had no idea where she lived, and she was the only kid I knew in the area. Almost unconsciously, I began to head towards the creek. I had only promised I wouldn't cross it, after all, and if she was so concerned about my whereabouts, she should have let me know where she was going to be. Besides, if she had been able to outpace the odd kids when they were right beside her, I would be able to get away long before they got close. My legs were filled with a giddy, nervous energy as I kept walking, sometimes at a quick pace and others at barely a shuffle. Once the creek itself was in view, I began to move from tree to tree, using them like cover from whatever might lurk on the other side of the creek. I inched closer, cautious to not disturb even a single twig in my approach. Finally, I was only a few yards from the near bank of the creek. I crouched down and quietly got to my hands and knees, closing the last stretch on all fours and keeping a close watch on the trees ahead of me. I hissed out Jessie's name in a low voice, straining my ears into the woods to catch anything of interest. But nothing happened. It was just another ordinary day, and I was just some weird little boy whispering into the forest. I was just about to turn around when a brief flash of movement caught my eye. I hadn't noticed it before because I was scanning the ground, but turning my eyes up, I saw a silhouette of something I couldn't quite make out. It swayed gently in the breeze as though it was suspended from the branches. The leaves broke up the distant form, which must have been several dozens of feet away. And I immediately forgot my promise to Jessie. I had to know what that thing was. Just as I was about to swing my legs down the bank of the creek, a call startled me to my feet in an instant. "What are you doing?" Jessie was standing a ways behind me, clinging onto a tree as though she might fall without its support. Though her tone was one of anger, her face was ghost white. She beckoned me towards her, clearly unwilling to go closer to the creek than she was. I twisted my body around, raising an arm to point at the thing I had seen in the treetops. But I couldn't relocate it. I saw something," I said, scanning the leaves for the swaying form. "And with any luck, it didn't see you," she hissed, stamping her foot in the dirt. I shook my head, my boyish curiosity trumping her obvious fear. "Don't be such a scaredy cat," I said, crouching down to see if I could find the figure in the branches. Briefly, I wondered if it had moved, but that seemed impossible. Whatever it was, it wasn't animate. "I'm going across." "No," Jessie screamed, lunging towards me. I was already startled by her cry, and mid-turn she collided into me at full force, sending us both tumbling down the bank and into the creek. We yelled and flailed as we fell, both of us landing on my back. The muddy water babbled over us and I scooted away, pulling myself onto the far bank of the creek. Jessie followed, more out of a desire to get out of the water than anything. "Nice going," I said sarcastically. The water was actually a little refreshing in the summertime heat, but we knew that before long we'd be drowning in humidity, our damp clothes suffocating what little comfort sweating brought. I crawled up onto the opposite side of the creek, once again raising my eyes to the branches to find what I'd seen. Please can we go?" Jessie was at my side, clutching my arm despite the fact that I was a good half a foot shorter than she was. "We really need to go. Please, come on. Just a little bit further." Wonder and excitement had overtaken all other emotions in my mind. Before, when the creek was just a memory, it was easy to picture a world of monsters lurking just across the way. Now that I was here, in the light of day, I felt empowered. I could see that there weren't monsters, so obviously I was safe. I'm lucky to be alive. Tugging Jessie forward, I walked to the spot where I had seen the thing hanging from the trees. But now it was nowhere to be found. From where I was standing I could still make out the creek, and I tried to imagine myself crouched low on the other side, looking up into the branches. The wind blew lazily through the leaves, shaking them this way and that, but nothing unnatural hung from the canopy. "I saw something right here," I said aloud, justifying my persistence to Jessie. I did feel bad for dragging her somewhere she obviously didn't want to be, and I thought if I'd had something to show for it, maybe she would have understood. Instead, here I was, staring up into the trees like an idiot with a terrified girl clinging to my side. Her eyes darted back and forth across the tree line, as if waiting for something to suddenly appear and attack us. Unwilling to leave empty-handed, I coaxed us slowly forward. As we pressed on, the woods around us seemed to get quieter, as if we were entering some sort of dead zone in the forest. A place where even the birds and critters refused to go. Jessie's nails dug into my arm, but she stayed right by my side, no longer making any noise except a small whimper with every exhalation. After another 5 or 10 minutes of walking, we came across a rocky outcropping jutting out of the ground, and a small hole leading down. Intrigued as I was by the promise of more adventure, something else caught our attention. A strange doll laid propped against the mouth of the cave. Facing us, its elongated forehead drooped slightly over its face, making the upper right side of its head concave. Its eyes were small and beady and black, shining in the midday sun, and tufts of hair had been placed into its scalp in a disorganized manner. It was garbed only in small denim overalls covering grungy cloth skin. Before I could even draw breath to comment on it, Jessie was fiercely tugging me away. "That's it. That's one of them," she was practically screaming, raw terror coming through in her voice. But her reaction was scaring me more than the object itself. "That was an odd kid? An oversized doll? Calm down," I said, tugging back against her. "It can't be. Look at it. It's not breathing. It's just a doll," wrenching my arm out of her grip. Jessie fell face first in the dirt, but was on her feet a second later. I heard her starting to run and turned to tell her that she didn't have to get any closer if she was scared, that I would go examine it alone, as I stared in her direction. However, my voice caught in my throat. Standing where Jessie and I had been not 20 seconds ago was another doll. Only this one was different. It was cleaner and more well-made, as if whoever had made the one by the cave had learned from their mistakes. This girl doll was standing beside a tree, watching us with those same all-black eyes. Short brown hair matted with dirt and clumped to her head haphazardly. A tattered red dress clung desperately to her right shoulder, and beneath it the cloth skin looked much cleaner than the others. Much more real. Before I could say a word, Jessie broke the silence. I expected her to shriek, but instead what came out of her mouth was barely above a whisper. "Emma?" The girl doll took a step forward, and my terror levels shot up to their limits. I glanced backwards to see the other doll was pulling itself to its feet, awkwardly shambling towards us. Any doubt I had in Jessie's story evaporated in an instant. The odd kids were real, and they were right in front of me. Without another moment's hesitation, I grabbed Jessie's wrist, suddenly becoming the one desperate to get us out. Come on, let's go," I yelled at her, but she didn't even seem to hear me. She instead began to walk towards the girl doll. Towards Emma, I guessed, though I couldn't see how that could ever have been Jessie's friend. I kept pulling at her arm even as the thing behind her got closer. Jessie was focused exclusively on the other girl, blocking out the whole rest of the world. The doll reached out to Jessie, and she raised her own hand out as well. "Shiz," I began to say, but I was interrupted by a heavy object falling directly onto my best friend, sending her crumpling into the dirt. On top of her was a small, human-like figure, with the head and hands proportionally much smaller than they should have been. Finally observing one up close, I realized their skin wasn't just dirty cloth, it was rotten, mottled flesh. I scrambled backwards as the little creature gripped Jessie by the hair, tugging her head up painfully. Jessie screamed and clawed at the ground, trying to shove the thing off of her, but the creature she'd called Emma sagged to its knees, clamped a hand over her mouth, then turned its head to look at me. Energy surged to my legs and I shot upright. I was in full panic mode, operating on a primal instinct to flee. But just as I started to run, I collided into a solid force that knocked me back down to the ground. Another one of those things stood before me, his head flopping awkwardly to the left just as Jesse had demonstrated. The one I had seen slumped by the cave came into my view, holding a large rock in its hands. Before I could roll out of the way, the weight came down on my head, sending a splitting pain through my skull. My vision went white and a deafening ringing filled my ears. But I stayed conscious throughout. I could faintly feel things tugging at me, pulling me across the ground as I struggled just to regain my senses. The blinding white slowly faded to an impenetrable black, and the ringing dulled to formless shuffling and the odd kid's strange chitters echoing off the walls of the cave. I did my best to stay limp as I was dragged across rough stone, tearing into my shirt and cutting my flesh. I'm certain I whimpered in pain, but the odd kids didn't react to it, hauling me further into their lair. Eventually the motion came to an end. I was propped against a rough stone wall, and even in the darkness I could tell that one of them was just in front of my face, quietly muttering to itself in those strange, arrhythmic noises. Its coarse fingers grabbed my hands and it began stretching a strong, thin fabric around my wrists, binding them together. It wrapped for what felt like ages, until it finally seemed satisfied that my hands weren't going anywhere, then moved on to my ankles to do the same. Once that was done, the thing shuffled away, the noise of its movements getting gradually fainter before disappearing altogether. Meaning to breathe a sigh of relief, I instead let out a choked sob, finally letting myself express the terror I'd felt through the whole ordeal. I'm not ashamed to admit that I sat in that cave and cried, certain I'd never see my parents or grandparents ever again. Only when I heard more movement coming my way did I make any effort to quiet myself. I did my best to control my breathing, sucking in breaths through shuddering gasps and letting them out slowly through my nose. I tried to picture what the noises were. Slowly, I put together that someone else was being dragged down the same rough path I had been. They were bringing Jesse back here, too. For a brief moment, I felt hope, as selfish as it is to admit. At the very least, I took comfort in knowing that I wouldn't have to suffer alone. Part of me even entertained the notion that perhaps together Jesse and I could escape this cave and never, ever come back to these awful woods again. Of course, the reality of this plan had many obstacles. The cave was utterly dark, something that didn't seem to affect the odd kids one bit. For all I knew, there was one sitting in the room with me, silently watching and waiting for me to make a move so it could pounce on me again and finish the job. On top of that, they easily outnumbered us. The odds were stacked against us in every conceivable way. Jessie noisily entered the room in which I was kept, and her muffled screaming gave me a sense of the dimensions of the room. It seemed smaller than I expected, likely only a little bigger than my own bedroom. Still, it was plenty big for storing the two of us. Just as I was wondering if they would leave Jesse and me alone together, the room was filled with a soft blue luminescence. One of the odd kids, I couldn't tell which with their back turned to me, was brushing their fingers against a strange kind of moss on the far wall. And the agitation sparked a chain reaction across the entire plant. Tendrils of blue light arced over the wall in a brilliant pattern, the illumination branching off itself like a snowflake before finally filling in, covering the cave wall in the most beautiful display I'd ever seen. And there, in front of the glowing moss, was Jessie. She had been laid out on an obviously man-made dirt platform, and her struggles stilled as puffs of spores from the glowing moss fell onto her. The odd kid stood over her, observing for a moment, before bending forward over her. In my life I had never heard the sound of flesh tearing. But the very first time was unmistakable. I jerked at the noise, as if it had been my own skin, and my heart beat so fast I worried that it would give me away. I screwed my eyes shut and just listened as the odd kid did God knows what to my helpless friend only a few feet from my face. Mustering up what courage I could, I began to work the bonds around my wrists against a jagged rock, working just slow enough to not make too much noise. The ripping noise soon gave way to gurgles and wet squishing, but I didn't allow myself to picture it. Instead, I thought about my grandparents, about seeing their warm smiles one more time. I thought about the airplane that would take me out of Mississippi, and I thought of every excuse I would ever use for the rest of my life to keep from getting on another plane back. I had to survive this. I had to. Sure enough, the ropes came free with enough effort. Once they were weak enough, I managed to pull them apart with brute strength, the fibers tearing away from each other with a soft sound. Something that was almost pleasing contrasted against the disturbing noises coming from across the room. I groped around in the near dark, my fingers moving from rock to rock until I found something loose enough and big enough that I felt comfortable with it. I now stared directly at the odd kid, its back still turned as it performed its macabre ritual on my friend, sawing the rock across the ropes around my ankles. I worked my nerve up to what I was going to have to do next. Armed with the rock, I was going to attack the odd kid, knocking them out with one good blow. Fair play, I thought to myself. Next I would grab Jessie and hoist her over my shoulder. She was taller than me. Sure, but I wasn't a weak kid. After that, we would sneak out of the cave somehow, then sprint back to my grandparents' house and be safe. The wraps across my ankles fell away, and I slowly stretched my legs out before getting them underneath me. The odd kid was still oblivious to me, and part of me hated that. Here I was, about to bash in its skull with a rock, and it didn't even consider me enough of a threat to turn around and check on me. "Hey," I whispered. The rock clutched tight in my fist as I held it out to the side behind my head. The odd kid finally swiveled around and I stared into its soulless black eyes one last time before bringing the weapon across. The sensation was nothing like I expected. Instead of a solid blow and a resonating crack, my hand squelched through its blotchy skin with little resistance. I stood there, stunned and staring into its remaining eye as its face hung loosely around my wrist. Soft scratches made their way across my hand and I jerked it back, the force of my fist pulling out of its head, tearing another gouge through the skin that was not skin. Looking down at my hand, I saw the single most horrific thing I have ever seen in my life. Instead of brains, blood and gore covering my hand, there were bugs, centipedes, spiders, ants and more, too numerous to count, swarmed over my skin. The bag of flesh before me slumped to its knees before keeling over, its occupant surging out of the hole in its neck. I lost it. I screamed at the top of my lungs and beat my arm against the wall of the cave, sloughing off the vermin in sheets. Through the chaos I called out Jessie's name, forgetting at the time that I had already expected her to be unconscious at best. Her head tilted to the side and she raised herself up onto her elbows. Staring at me, my heart swelled, thinking for a moment that if nothing else, at least we would get out of this alive. When the azure glow of the moss reflected off Jessie's all-black eyes, I ran. Through the darkness I ran, heedless of the frantic chittering that echoed off the stone all around me. I ran into every single twist and turn in those tight tunnels, still struggling to scrape all the bugs off my arm. With every passing moment I expected to feel the odd kid's hands wrap around my legs, drag me back to that room, and do to me what they'd done to Jessie. Turn me into one of them. Finally I saw a thin shaft of light at the end of the darkness. I scrambled out of the cave and into the open woods, the full moon giving me plenty of illumination to find my way. Through the entire sprint I tore at the flesh of my arm with my fingernails, scraping off the remains of the odd kid as they wriggled and crawled across me. The entire run is mostly a blur now. I didn't stop once, didn't even peek behind me for fear of seeing those things one more time. When I burst into my grandparents' house, the two of them were both awake, sitting up in the living room waiting for me. I must have told a tale with a single look, because their stern expressions melted upon seeing my eyes and they stayed up with me the rest of the night. Sitting on the couch and wrapped in a blanket, I just stared out the window at the dusty road that led from the house, praying that I wouldn't see Jessie walking down it. The next day, after I'd slept and eaten, my grandparents tried to coax out of me what happened. I didn't know what to tell them. Eventually, I told them I'd just fallen asleep in the woods and had a nightmare. Freaked myself out and ran home crying. They hugged me and laughed gently, and my grandpa said I should call ahead the next time I'm going to worry them half to death. I smiled and Jessie's face appeared in my mind's eye. I didn't let myself be alone for the rest of the vacation. This meant staying indoors for the most part, something I was more than fine with. When word got out that Jessie hadn't been home in a few days and people started searching, my grandparents asked me if I knew anything about it. I wanted to tell them about the odd kids. I should have said something. I know that now, but, like the scared child I was, I just said I didn't and they left it at that. 3 weeks later I got on a plane and went home. And for the first time since the cave I felt like I could breathe again. I no longer had the threat of the odd kids looming over me, just waiting for a moment's lapse in readiness so they could pounce. I'd like to say that I don't know what happened to Jessie, that her fate remains a mystery, but that would be the coward's way out. Jessie died because of me, because of my hubris, my curiosity and my stupid thirst for adventure. Jessie lost her life. This is something I think about every day, even some 30 years later, and it hurts just as much as the very first time I realized it. Thousands of miles and a couple decades now lay between me and the worst summer of my life. But it isn't perspective that's prompted me to finally write out my tale. My daughter Maggie has been getting excited about collecting bugs, and as uneasy as it may make me, I'm not the kind to stop her. What really unsettles me about it is how her bugs act every time she brings me one of her little jars. The bugs inside watch me. I know how crazy this sounds. I know bugs don't see like you and I, but it's like they want me to know that they know I'm there. I went into my daughter's room a few days ago when she was out at school and picked up her ant farm to see what would happen. I expected them to freeze, to turn and look at me. But instead they went into a frenzy. Every last ant swarmed the side of the container, crawling over each other and climbing against the plastic that separated them from my right hand. The hand the bugs were on for minutes as I stumbled blindly through that cave. Frantically clawing them off, I watched, horrified, as the ants literally tore each other apart to be the one closest to my hand. What did the odd kids do to me? Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.